She stood alone in a sea of candlelight, and not a single soul looked her way. The ballroom of Thornwood Hall glittered like a jewel box, every chandelier dripping with wax and wealth, every guest draped in silk and expectation. Evelyn Thornwood, Duchess of Ashthorne, pressed her spine against the cold marble pillar and reminded herself to breathe. It was her own home, her own celebration, and yet she had never felt so completely invisible. Across the polished floor, her husband walked without hesitation. The Duke of Thornwood moved through the crowd with the same quiet authority he carried everywhere, his dark hair perfectly swept back, his evening coat immaculate, his handsome face a mask of polite indifference. He nodded to lords, inclined his head to ladies, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and never once glanced toward his wife. Evelyn watched his path carve a wide arc around her, as if she were a piece of furniture no one had bothered to move. Her gloved fingers tightened around the stem of her own untouched glass. A sharp ache lodged beneath her ribs, a wound she had learned to nurse in silence. Two women stood nearby, their voices carrying just enough to wound. She's been standing there for nearly an hour. He hasn't spoken to her once. Can you blame him? The marriage was an arrangement. He never wanted her. Poor thing, I heard her father all but begged for the match. The Duke simply did his duty. Duty, that word had become a cage. Evelyn lifted her chin and let the whispers slide over her skin like rain. She had done this for 2 years. 2 years of carefully planned dinners he barely touched. 2 years of waiting at the window of his study door with a tray of tea, only to be met with a distant nod and a quiet dismissal. 2 years of sleeping alone in a vast bedchamber, while her husband buried himself in estate ledgers and parliamentary papers until the candles burned down to nothing. She had believed, foolishly, that patience might soften him. That devotion might eventually be met with warmth. But the man who had placed a ring on her finger at the altar had looked through her from that very first day, and nothing she had done had ever changed the direction of his gaze. Tonight, something inside her finally cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, quiet fissure in the wall of hope she had built around her heart. She watched him pause beside Lady Margaret Waltham, a beautiful widow with copper hair and a knowing smile, and saw the way his posture relaxed, the way he actually listened. Lady Margaret placed a hand on his sleeve, laughing at something he said, and the Duke did not pull away. Evelyn set her champagne down on a passing tray and walked out of the ballroom without a sound. No one noticed the Duchess leave her own party, no one at all. The corridors of Thornwood Hall stretched long and silent beyond the music. Evelyn's footsteps echoed softly on the marble as she climbed the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the carved banister. Portraits of long-dead Thornwood ancestors stared down at her with painted eyes, generations of formidable dukes and sorrowful duchesses, and she wondered if any of them had ever felt this hollow. She reached her chambers and closed the door behind her. The fire in the grate had dwindled to embers. Her lady's maid, gentle old Mrs. Harrow, had long since retired, not expecting her mistress to abandon the festivities so early. Evelyn did not ring for her. She simply stood in the center of the room, still wearing her ivory silk gown, and let the silence wrap around her like a shroud. Tomorrow, she decided, everything would change. Not the Duke, not the marriage, not the cold, transactional arrangement that had bound her life to a man who could not stand to look at her, but she would change. She would stop waiting by doors, stop preparing tea that would grow cold, stop scanning his face for some flicker of affection that would never come. If she was destined to be invisible, then she would find a place where she could be seen, somewhere beyond these gilded walls, somewhere her heart might still have a purpose. The first light of morning found her still awake, sitting at her writing desk, penning a list of all the estate charities the Duke had long neglected. Orphanages, tenants' cottages in need of repair, a crumbling parish school, causes that had once been overseen by the previous Duchess, his mother, before she had passed. Evelyn dipped her quill and wrote until her hand ached, and with every line she felt the first fragile stirring of something she had nearly forgotten. Purpose. The Dowager Duchess had been a woman of fierce compassion, and her absence had left a void no one had bothered to fill. Eveline intended to fill it, not for his approval, not to be noticed, but because there was still good she could do in the world, even if her own world had turned to dust. She fell asleep at the desk as dawn broke, her cheek resting on the list, and for the first time in months she did not dream of her husband at all. The change began quietly, so quietly that the Duke of Thornwood did not notice it for nearly a fortnight. He was accustomed to his wife's presence as one grows accustomed to the ticking of a clock. She was always there, a soft-footed shadow at the edges of his day. The morning tea tray outside his study door, prepared exactly as he liked it. The gentle inquiries about his sleep, his correspondence, his plans for the day. The hopeful pauses in her voice, waiting for him to offer something more than a curt reply. He had grown so used to deflecting those pauses that he no longer registered them as pain. So when the tea stopped appearing, he assumed for the first 2 mornings that the servants had simply been delayed. On the third morning, he opened his study door himself and found the hallway empty. A mild irritation flickered through him, quickly suppressed. He rang for a footman and thought nothing more of it. It was not until the fourth day, at breakfast, that he realized something had shifted. Eveline was already seated when he entered the morning room. She looked up from her plate, offered him a polite smile, and returned her attention to a sheaf of papers beside her toast. No nervous chatter, no careful questions about whether he had slept well. Her hair was pinned elegantly beneath a simple lace cap, her morning dress the pale blue of a winter sky, and her expression was utterly serene. Alaric Thornwood paused in the doorway. He could not have said why. Perhaps it was the absence of tension in the air, the lack of that faint, tremulous energy that usually crackled around his wife whenever he entered a room. She looked perfectly content, perfectly at peace, and she did not look at him. He took his seat. The silence stretched. Eveline turned a page of her papers, made a small notation with a pencil, and took a bite of toast. "What are you reading?" he heard himself ask, the words escaping before he could catch them. She glanced up again as if mildly surprised he had spoken. An assessment of the East Village School. The roof caved in last winter, and the children have been learning in the church vestry ever since. I'm arranging repairs. He blinked. "You are?" "Yes." She returned her gaze to the paper. "I've already spoken to the steward. The funds can be drawn from the charitable trust your mother established. I'll visit the village this afternoon to meet with the schoolmaster." A strange, uncomfortable sensation crept up the back of his neck. He cleared his throat. "You needn't trouble yourself with such matters, Eveline. The steward can manage." "I know he can." She lifted her teacup, her smile unwavering. "But I wish to be useful." Useful? The word landed strangely in the air between them. She had always wished to be useful to him, to their marriage, to the quiet domestic sphere he had expected her to occupy. But this was different. This had nothing to do with him at all. "Very well," he said, because he could think of nothing else. Eveline nodded and finished her breakfast, and 10 minutes later she excused herself with a calm grace that left him staring at the empty doorway long after she had gone. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of everything Alaric had come to expect. His wife was never in the house. She left early each morning, wrapped in a practical wool cloak, a basket of provisions on her arm. She returned late in the afternoon with mud on her hem and color in her cheeks, and she did not seek him out. She ate dinner with quiet composure, answered his sparse questions with pleasant but brief replies, and retired to her chambers without lingering. He learned from the steward that she had taken on the orphanage project entirely. She had organized a volunteer rota of local women, secured donations of blankets and food, and even taught reading lessons to the older children 3 days a week. The tenants adored her. The vicar could not speak of her without tears of gratitude. The estate, which had slumbered in benign neglect since his mother's death, was quietly coming alive again under the hands of a woman he had barely looked at for 2 years. And she did not need him for any of it. The realization settled into Alaric's chest like a stone. He tried to dismiss it. This was what he had wanted, was it not? A wife who did not cling, did not hover, did not drown him in emotional expectations he could not fulfill. He had married her out of necessity, a duty to her dying father, and a tangle of political obligations he had never fully explained to her. He had told himself that keeping her at arm's length was the kindest thing he could do. She would be a duchess in name, protected and provided for, free to live her life without the burden of a man who had nothing soft left to give. But watching her now, he began to wonder if he had been monstrously wrong. The first true crack in his composure came on a crisp autumn afternoon when he returned early from a meeting with a neighboring landowner. He rode up the long gravel drive, intending to head straight for his study, but a sound caught his attention and turned his horse's head toward the orchard. Laughter, bright, easy, unrestrained laughter, his wife's laughter. Alaric dismounted and walked the last few yards on foot, staying close to the old stone wall that bordered the orchard. Through the bare branches of the apple trees, he saw her. Eveline sat on a fallen log, her cloak spread beneath her, a half-eaten apple in her hand. Beside her sat a man he did not recognize at first glance. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-streaked brown hair and a laugh that matched her own. He was leaning close, pointing at something in the grass, and Eveline was shaking her head, her eyes bright with amusement, her cheeks flushed with the cold. It was Lord William Ashby. Alaric placed the face after a long, slow moment. A baron from the next county, a childhood friend of Eveline's family, recently returned from years abroad. They had been close as children, he recalled, and clearly time had not eroded the ease between them. A hot, unfamiliar sensation coiled in Alaric's gut. He stood frozen, watching William Ashby pluck a late autumn daisy from the grass and present it to Eveline with an exaggerated bow. She laughed again, accepted the flower, and tucked it into the clasp of her cloak. The Duke turned on his heel and walked back to the house without making a sound. That evening, he found himself watching her across the dinner table with an intensity that bordered on rudeness. Eveline ate her soup with the same serene grace she now carried everywhere, seemingly unaware of his scrutiny. She mentioned, in passing, that Lord Ashby had called to invite them both to a small gathering at his estate the following week. "I told him we would be delighted," she said, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "It will be pleasant to see old friends." "You accepted without consulting me." The words came out sharper than he intended. Eveline's eyes lifted, calm and unblinking. "I did not think you would mind. You rarely attend social gatherings. I assumed you would prefer not to be troubled with the decision." The implication was clear. She had stopped expecting his company. She had made peace with his absence and built a life around it. And now, without his permission, without his notice, she had become a woman who did not need him to fill a single empty space. "I will attend," he said, the words heavy as stones. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly masked. "As you wish." The night of Lord Ashby's gathering was the first time Alaric Thornwood truly understood the depth of his own folly. The Baron's manor was modest but welcoming, lit with candles and filled with the scent of mulled wine. Eveline moved through the rooms like a woman reborn. She was greeted with genuine warmth by every guest, not as the Duke's overlooked wife, but as Lady Eveline, the woman who had rebuilt the orphanage, who had visited the sick, who had rallied the village to repair the school. She had carved out an identity entirely separate from him, and in this room that identity shone. William Ashby rarely left her side. He fetched her wine, steered her toward the best seats by the fire, and leaned down to murmur things that made her smile. It was the smile that undid Alaric, that soft, unguarded smile she had once reserved for him, the one he had never bothered to return. She gave it freely now to another man, and the sight of it burned like acid in his throat. Lady Margaret Waltham found him brooding near the window. She placed a proprietary hand on his arm, her copper hair glinting in the firelight. "Your Duchess seems quite at home," she observed, her tone silky. "Lord Ashby is terribly charming, is he not? I hear they were inseparable as children." "Some attachments never fade." Alaric did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on his wife, who was now laughing at something William had whispered, her head tilted back, her throat exposed, lovely and unreachable. Something cracked open inside him, something he had spent years sealing shut. Jealousy, sharp, irrational, all-consuming jealousy. He had no right to it. He knew that. He had done nothing to earn her smiles, her devotion, her quiet efforts. He had thrown them all back at her like waste paper. And now, watching her bloom in the light of another man's attention, he realized he had discarded a treasure he had never deserved in the first place. The ride home was silent. The carriage swayed through the dark countryside, and Evelyn sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, her expression peaceful. She did not fill the silence with chatter. She did not ask his thoughts. She simply existed, contained and whole, and that wholeness terrified him. "You enjoyed yourself tonight," he said at last, his voice rough. "I did," she admitted softly, "very much." "Ashby seems fond of you." She turned her head, and in the dim lantern light he saw a flicker of something guarded in her eyes. "William is a dear friend. We've known each other since childhood. Friendship can become something more." The words hung in the cold air. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, and then she did something that cut deeper than any accusation. She smiled. Not the bright smile she had given Ashby, but a small, sad, knowing smile that held no hope and no anger. "I am your wife, Alaric. I have never forgotten that, even when you did." The carriage fell silent again. He had no reply. What could he possibly say? That he had been a fool, that he had spent 2 years drowning in his own guilt and fear, and that her patience had been the only lighthouse in the storm, and he had smashed it to pieces with his own hands. The words felt too small, too late, too monstrously inadequate. When they reached Thornwood Hall, she bade him good night and climbed the stairs without looking back. He stood in the entrance hall for a long time, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade, and felt the full weight of her absence settle over him like a shroud. The days that followed were a slow, torturous revelation. Alaric began to notice things he had ignored for years. The way the footmen brightened when the Duchess entered the room. The way the cook saved the choicest pastries for her afternoon return. The stack of thank-you letters on the hall table, all addressed to her, all overflowing with gratitude from tenants, vicars, and schoolteachers. His wife had built an entire world of quiet goodness while he had been locked in his study, nursing wounds that had nothing to do with her. He found himself lingering near the orphanage one afternoon under the pretense of inspecting a drainage ditch. He stood at the edge of the muddy yard and watched through a window as Evelyn knelt beside a small, crying child, her skirts soaking up the damp, her voice low and soothing. She wiped the child's tears with her own handkerchief, then pulled a small wooden toy from her basket and pressed it into the little hands. The child's sobs quieted. A wobbly smile appeared. Alaric's throat tightened. He turned and walked away before she could see him. That night he sat alone in his study and pulled a small, dust-covered box from the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay a miniature portrait of Evelyn, painted the year before their marriage. He had commissioned it in secret, months before her father had approached him with the desperate plea that had sealed their fates. He had loved her from afar for years, a silent, hopeless infatuation he had never dared to voice. When her father's scandal threatened to ruin her, he had seized the chance to marry her, but he had bound himself with a terrible vow. He would protect her, provide for her, shield her from every consequence of her father's sins. But he would never burden her with his love. She had not chosen him. She had been given to him, and he could not bear to see the light in her eyes turn to obligation. So he had frozen himself. He had built walls so high that even her gentleness could not scale them. And now, sitting alone with her portrait, he saw the truth with devastating clarity. He had not protected her from pain, he had caused it. A soft sound broke the silence, a creak of floorboards in the hall. Alaric lifted his head, listening. The sound came again, followed by a quiet, muffled sob. He rose and opened the door. The corridor was dark, lit only by the distant glow of a dying candle in the gallery. At the far end, half hidden in the shadows, stood Evelyn. She was leaning against the wall, her shoulders shaking, her hand pressed to her mouth. She had not seen him. He watched, frozen, as his wife wept alone in the dark. She cried without making a sound, the way someone learns to cry when they know no one is coming to comfort them. The sight shattered something inside him, a final, brittle wall he had not even known remained. He took a step toward her. The floorboard groaned. She gasped, spun around, and her tear-streaked face was suddenly illuminated by the distant candle. Alaric, her voice was raw, startled. She swiped at her cheeks, trying to erase the evidence. I thought you were asleep. Why are you crying? The question came out hoarse, desperate. She shook her head, a broken little gesture. It's nothing, a moment of foolishness. Please don't trouble yourself. Evelyn, he reached for her, his hand closing gently around her wrist. She flinched, not from his touch but from the unfamiliarity of it. When had he last touched her? A brush of hands at dinner, a formal arm offered at a ball. He could not remember. He had starved her of even the simplest affection. Tell me, he whispered, please. Her composure cracked. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her lashes. I received a letter this afternoon. My father's old steward, the one who knew everything. He's dying and he wanted to clear his conscience. Her voice broke. He told me why you married me, Alaric, the debts, the scandal, the ruin my father would have faced. You saved my family. You saved me, and I never knew. He felt the blood drain from his face. She knew. The one secret he had buried, the reason he had kept his distance, thinking she would feel indebted, trapped, forced to perform gratitude for a marriage she had not wanted. She knew, and she was weeping as if her heart had shattered. It was not a sacrifice, he said roughly. I wanted to marry you. I have wanted it since the first moment I saw you, years before your father ever came to me. Her eyes flew to his, wide with shock. What? The words came now like a flood, unstoppable. I saw you at a garden party when you were 17. You were laughing with your friends. And the sunlight caught your hair and I could not breathe. I told myself it was a passing fancy, but it never passed. When your father came to me, desperate, I saw a chance. Not a duty, a gift. But I was afraid, Evelyn, afraid that if I showed you my heart you would feel obligated, trapped. So I buried it. I buried it so deep that I made you think I did not care at all. She stared at him, tears still streaming, her lips parted in disbelief. You loved me. All this time you loved me and you said nothing. I thought I was protecting you. You were destroying me. Her voice cracked on the last word. I thought you could not bear the sight of me. I thought I was nothing to you but an inconvenience. I waited for you, Alaric. I waited for 2 years for a single kind word, a single glance that meant something, and you gave me nothing. He pulled her gently into his arms, and this time she did not resist. She collapsed against his chest, her body racked with sobs, her fists clutching the front of his coat. He held her as if she were made of glass, as if she might shatter at any moment, and he buried his face in her hair and let his own tears fall silently. I am sorry, he whispered over and over. I am so deeply, unbearably sorry. I loved you too late, but I love you now. I have always loved you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it if you will let me. She did not answer with words. Not then. She simply cried against him, releasing 2 years of loneliness and confusion and quiet, stubborn hope. And he held her in the dark corridor, knowing that he did not deserve her forgiveness, but hoping with every fiber of his scarred heart that she might give it anyway. The thaw came slowly, like spring creeping over frozen ground. Evelyn did not rush back into his arms. She had been wounded too deeply for that. But she did not retreat either. She allowed him small gestures. a cup of tea brought to her study door by his own hands, a bouquet of winter roses left on her breakfast plate, an afternoon ride through the estate side by side, the silence between them no longer heavy with pain but tentative and new. He visited the orphanage with her. He knelt in the mud and let a grubby-fisted toddler tug on his cravat, and when he looked up and saw Eveline watching him with a soft, unreadable expression, he felt hope flicker to life for the first time in years. One evening, as they sat together by the fire in the smaller drawing room, she reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small pressed flower, dried and fragile, tied with a faded blue ribbon. A daisy. The daisy William Ashby had given her that afternoon in the orchard. His heart clenched. She held it out to him. "You saw this, didn't you? That day in the orchard." He nodded, his throat tight. "I saw. I kept it because it reminded me that someone still saw me, even if it was only a friend." She turned the daisy over in her fingers. "But I don't need it anymore. I want you to have it." He took the flower with trembling hands. "Why?" "Because I am ready to be seen by you," she said softly. "Fully seen, if you are still willing." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes burning. "I have seen you from the very beginning. I was just too much of a coward to show it." She smiled then, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and lit up the quiet room. "Then show me now." And so he did. He showed her in the days that followed, not with grand gestures but with 1,000 small ones. He learned the names of the children at the orphanage. He walked with her through the village and introduced her to every tenant as his Duchess, his wife, his partner. He sat with her in the evenings and listened to her dreams for the estate, and he shared his own. He let her see the man beneath the mask, the one who had been terrified and foolish and deeply, desperately in love. And in return, she let him see the woman she had become. Not the lonely, waiting shadow, but the strong, radiant soul who had rebuilt a community with her bare hands. Together, they began to build something new, something neither of them had ever dared to hope for. The first snowfall of winter blanketed Thornwood Hall on the night they finally spoke their vows again, not in a grand cathedral but in the quiet of their own bedchamber, before the hearth, with no witnesses but the flames. "I loved you too late," Alaric said, his forehead pressed to hers. "But I will love you for the rest of my life, and that will have to be enough." Eveline cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away the tears he no longer tried to hide. "It was never too late," she whispered. "I was always waiting. I just didn't know what I was waiting for. Now I do." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent. A kiss that held all the words they had never spoken, all the years they had lost, all the hope of the years still to come. And when they finally drew apart, the fire crackled and the snow fell softly against the window, and the great, silent house seemed to breathe a long, contented sigh. In the morning, they walked out together into the new snow. The orphanage bell rang in the distance, calling the children to lessons. The village chimneys trailed smoke into the pale sky, and the Duke and Duchess of Thornwood walked hand in hand, leaving 2 sets of footprints in the unbroken white, a new path forged from the wreckage of old sorrows. She was no longer invisible. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. They had found each other at last, and the world, cold and bright and full of possibility, stretched out before them, waiting to be loved.